So that's working pretty well. Now let's come up and let's add the start state for it. So technically that should only happen when someone is hovering. So now let's remove this hover value and let's add the transition. So I'll add transition, 1 second. I want it to be nice and slow. And then I want the starting color to be transparent. So I'll hit save here, and now if you hit refresh, you can see that it's not there, but when you hover over, you can see that that's when it appears. So let's see, and I'm seeing you see that little jump? So I'm thinking that in order to fix that, I think what I need to do is to have the font weight also there as well. So if I save that and hit refresh, there we go. You see how much smoother that is? And the reason for that is because the font weight was starting here and it was starting at its normal value. So we were catching and we were able to see that little transition from normal all the way to the font weight of 600. So that was the fix there. And now technically that is all of the styles that we need. So we still have some for the about page, just a few, but those are all the styles. So now let's hop over and let's add the JavaScript code. Now, JavaScript code, typically where you're going to see it is at the very, very bottom of the page. And the reason for that is because JavaScript works with selectors, very similar to the way that CSS does, but you would not want your JavaScript code to run before the entire page is loaded. So we're going to actually go under the body tag here, and that's where we're going to add our JavaScript code. And the way that you can tell HTML that you want to run JavaScript is by creating a script tag, just like this. Make sure you have a closing and opening one, and then just like that. And now we're going to select the portfolio items. So we're going to grab all of the portfolio items on the page. Now, if you've never done this before, don't worry, it is not like magic whatsoever. We can just come here, and if you come into the console, you're going to be able to see how we can do that. So I'm going to just build out a little selector here. So I'm going to say $, and then inside of make sure you use an apostrophe, and then say dot portfolio item wrapper, and then you can see that it pulls in that portfolio item wrapper. It pulls in the very first one that it finds. So that means that that is working properly. You can do a selector. Now this syntax right here is actually what the browsers allow you to do in order to work with JavaScript code. Now JavaScript has a little bit different syntax, but I wanted to do that first one just so you could see what you can do inside of the browser. Now what we want to do is to store it in a variable. So the way you can do that, and if you are not familiar with JavaScript, you've never touched it before, do not worry. You can just simply follow along and see the process. So I'm going to say const portfolio items. What this means is I'm creating a variable called portfolio items. And now I can say document dot query selector all. So I'm saying that I want you to find all of the elements on the page that have that selector. So we can even come here and just copy this, because we already know this works. So paste that in here. And now if I run that, nothing gets returned. But if I click on portfolio items, we have this really nice little node list. And you see how it says 12? That means that it selected all 12 of these blocks here. So that means it's working, and if you want to click and expand it, you can see it. Grab each one of those portfolio item wrappers, and we have access to everything, including a very important element, which is to add an event listener. So the same way that we listen to the hover state in CSS, we can do that in JavaScript. Except with JavaScript, you have to be a little bit more explicit. So I just copied that code here. So that is exactly what we already entered into the browser. So we know that works. And now I'm going to loop over these. So I'm going to add an event listener. So I'll say portfolio items dot for each, and for each takes a function. So what a function is, if you've never worked with JavaScript functions, is it's just a process that runs. And so we're saying we want you to run this process for each one of the portfolio items. We need to be explicit and say we want you to work with all of them. Now, when I say portfolio item just like this, I'm giving what's called a iterator variable. Now, this may look really weird if you've never seen it before, but this is not a special name. I could say X right here, or I, but I wouldn't recommend it, mainly because if you did, you wouldn't really know what you're talking about. But I like being explicit with the name. So I'm going to say portfolio item, then you do the equals greater than symbol. So that's called an arrow function in JavaScript, followed by curly braces. And so now everything inside of here, every time that the page loads, is going to be run. And it's going to be run and applied on those portfolio items. So now I can say, I can grab one of the singular ones. So as it's iterating, every time it goes through for each, it grabs that element, and then we can do whatever we want with it. So now I can say portfolio item, and then dot add event listener. So just like we added our hover state, here we don't call it hover though. The way JavaScript goes about it is it's called the mouse over event. And mouse over event also takes a function. So we're going to use our fun little arrow syntax again. So very similar to the same syntax we had here. The only difference is for the for each loop, we passed in an argument. This portfolio item is called a iterator variable, but it's in the item slot. Here, we didn't have any arguments, so we're just running what's called an anonymous function. So we're saying just go and run this process. So here I'm going to do this, and let's just log it out. So I'm going to say console.log, and then let's grab the element. So I'll say portfolio item, and let's just see what we have when we do this. So I'm going to hit save, clear this out with clear console. Now hit refresh. Now, if you hover over there, do you notice now how you have access? And it is now, every time you hover over one of the images, it's doing exactly what we wanted. So it is logging this value out. So the very last one that we should hover on should be this one. So now if I click on this, this tells me exactly what's there. So it gives me access to all the elements inside of it. It gives me the portfolio image background, the image text wrapper, everything like that. So that is perfect. That's exactly what we need. Because if you remember, the entire reason we're doing this is because we want, whenever someone hovers in, we want to add that class that we created. That, I forget the name of it, you have to reference it, the image darken class, I think. Yeah, so we want to add that. And so now that we have access to it, we can. So let's come back here. I'm going to get rid of the console log statement. And actually, you know what? Let me keep it up there for 1 second so you can see this, because as you may have noticed, this gives us a lot of data. It gives us the full div, but we only want one of the items here. So that part might be a little bit trickier if you've never done this before. So I don't want this next part I'm going to do to kind of intimidate you whatsoever. It is probably the most challenging part of this entire tutorial. So if it looks weird to you or anything like that, don't worry. It is all we're doing is we're taking that HTML object of that div and those classes, and we're using JavaScript to manipulate it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say portfolio item dot, which is what we just console logged, dot child nodes. So what that means is, if you remember, we had those child nodes, which means those nested divs. We had those nodes come out. So if I want to, I can just say console log